Welcome to the January edition of BBRO BeetCast. I'm Francesca Broom, your host and Knowledge Exchange Manager for BBRO. With the new year upon us, we thought we'd reflect on some of the questions we've had from growers in the recent weeks, and that involves impurities and sugar levels. So let's take a visit to the Wissey factory to just see how samples are dealt with, what goes through the tear house, and more importantly, what can we do to try and improve things in future?
So it's a busy day here at the Wissey factory, and I'm very pleased to be here with Perry Bateman, who is actually the science lead for British Sugar, and he's going to take us on a little bit of a journey through the arrival of beet right through to the tear house for your samples. So let's hear from Perry as to where we are now and what's going on.
Great, thanks Tez. So we're standing next to the inn bridge at Wissington factory, which is the first place where a lorry full of beet will arrive on our site. And what happens here is the gross weight of the lorry is measured, so it'll go onto a weigh bridge and we'll have the total weight of the vehicle and the contents coming onto site. At that point as well, a ticket will be issued to the driver. So that will enable us to track any samples that are taken from that lorry all the way through the process and into our computer system.
And the tickets that are issued, they're actually linked directly back to the grower's contracts, aren't they?
That's absolutely right. So there will be a contract identification card and a vehicle identification card that will be able to keep track of the lorries and the contracts that are coming in, because of course lorries are used for multiple contracts, so everything is kept in synchronisation with each other.
And do you time how long it takes for the lorries to get through the system?
Oh, not personally. I mean, some of it depends on whether, so if the lorry is sampled, it will go through to the sampling probes, which we'll get to in a minute. That will take a little bit of time. If it's not sampled, it will go straight through and it'll either be washed out directly into the factory through our Alpha wash system here, or it will be unloaded onto the flat pad where the beet will be piled up and stored for use outside of weighbridge opening times.
And I remember years ago, you'd have lorries queuing down the road, but now with the just-in-time, with the planning that goes on, the logistics, it very rarely happens. It's quite a quick turnaround, isn't it?
That's all credit to the guys in the beet intake system here. I have very little to do with that, I'm pleased to say, but yeah, it's a logistical masterpiece to keep it all flowing. It's an awful lot of beet lorries. A lot of beet has to come in to keep this place moving at full tilt when it's slicing. So yeah, lots to keep everybody working hard.
Right, so shall we just hold this next lorry up and we'll make our way across to the next point?
Good. Yep.
So it's good to see so much health and safety. Obviously, it helps with the whole factory health and safety remit, doesn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. It's right at the front of our agenda all day, every day. It should be top of everybody's list.
Right, so where are we now?
So we're just walking through the tear house building, but that's because it's just the easiest route to where we're going to next, which will be where the samples are actually taken from the beet lorries.
And an awful lot warmer than standing outside.
Indeed, yes. There's a little bit of rain in the air out there, isn't there? So.
I did just notice we passed the NFU office there. Is that where they're based?
Yes, yeah. They've got a representative at every site. And as this is where all the processing is done for the beet samples for payment purposes, there's clearly a significant presence here at all times to keep an eye on all of that.
Is that man 24 hours?
Whilst we're working, yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So what we're standing in front of here is our automated beet samplers. And what these do is they take essentially a core sample out of the back of the lorry. It's designed to take a representative sample of the contents of the lorry. It screws down into the trailer, lifts up a core, so a cross section essentially of the trailer's worth of contents, and then deposits that into a sample splitter. The splitter then drops all of that beet into a chute, which then divides it between two buckets essentially, so you get a paired sample potentially. And that'll be a sub-sample of the main sample, and that represents the content of the beet. And that amount of beet is about 25 kilos when it's down to a single bucket. This happens at all of the 4 manufacturing sites, and then the samples are brought to the central tear house here at Wissington for analysis. So no other site has this has the laboratory here for doing the analysis.
And I think someone might have noticed we've got a recorder out. So you say so there's 50 kilos in total that's taken out, and is that again? It's still mapped back to the contract number.
That's right, yeah. So when the bucket of beet is taken, there'll be a little ticket that's produced by the sampler. It's put into a little plastic tub that's screwed up tight and sealed, and that goes into the bucket with the beet sample, and so it travels with it for the rest of the process. So there's always an identification tag with the sample, so you can always link it back to whose contract it was, which vehicle delivered it.
So we've got a nice line of buckets in front of us. So this is obviously where the samples come in, and you've taken 2 samples from each load.
So only one of them is used.
Yeah.
The other would allow the collection of a duplicate sample, essentially. So it's normally only 1 bucket per sample actually comes here.
And it's amazing, actually, just looking at these buckets, the difference in size, soil, colour. You can see 1 or 2 that are obviously very, very wet, possibly a little bit of rot in there. But it's amazing the difference that we're looking at.
That's right. It's sort of a multicoloured dream coat here. Some of the more practised eyes think they can identify where the beets come from just by the way it looks, but I'm not sure I'm there yet with that, but you can certainly see some of the darker, peatier organic soils, and some of the lighter, sandier stuff is very easy to distinguish.
And slightly concerning is the amount of damage that we're looking at here. Now, could some of that damage be from the extraction process, or is that likely to be a fair sample of what we're looking at in the lorry?
There'll be some damage, obviously, as it's harvested and put into the lorries and things. There will be a little bit of breakage that might happen as the core sample is taken. It's a fairly large diameter core, so we hope to avoid too much of that. But you could probably see where the fresh damage is where it's nice and clean and white. That's probably where it's been nicked by something in the process. But some of the rest of it, like this, you can see that's. I was going to say
there's a few of the buckets here where you can see there's obviously been a lot of damage in field, isn't there? But I suppose that particularly those that are from really wet soils, conditions are that bad. They have to be cleaned really hard, and that vigorous process will come to some damage, won't there?
Yeah, I think that's right. And when we have nice dry conditions, light sandy soils, for example, the dirt just falls off the beet almost without much persuasion, which is a bit of a different scenario to where we are right now on the 5th of January.
And unfortunately, for the whole of this season, there hasn't been much of a time where you've had that nice dry conditions, have you?
That's right, yeah.
So from here, you've got quite a load of buckets all waiting to be processed.
That's right. So if you look over there, you can see how they come into the tear house. So we've got buckets coming up a conveyor belt, and each of those is associated with a sampled lorry. They come round and then they're manually lifted over here. So what we call this at the moment is the dirty beet sample, for obvious reasons. It's covered in soil and exactly as it was retrieved from the lorry. So the first thing we will need to do is to weigh the sample, and that will be the dirty weight of beet. So the objective here is, of course, to get the weight of the beet with the mud on it, the soil on it. And the next stage that is right in front of us is to wash the beet. So we're standing at the front end of the beet washers here. The beet and the sample stub identifier will go into the washer. And this is essentially like a washing machine with slats in it and high pressure spray bars that spray water onto the beet. And this is just to remove all the sand, the soil, the mud from the outside of the beet, and it'll come out the other side nice and clean. So we're now standing at the clean end of the washer, and you can see that the beet would be discharged out of the washer into a container here. You can see the path it takes through here. There's like a spiraled path on the inside of the washer that keeps the beet moving in the right direction. And conveniently, Blue Peter style, there is some clean beet right behind us.
I'm surprised the drums are a good, 8 to 10 foot?
Yeah, they're fairly substantial. I mean, you could see from the dirty beet, there's some pretty stubborn soil sometimes, particularly the clayey type soil, and of course in the grooves on the beet, and if you get any fanging or anything like that, it can be really quite challenging to remove the soil from that.
And then we have a nice clean sample in front of us.
Yes, so you can see that back to good as new, more or less. So yeah, that should have nearly all of the dirt removed from it. If there is any real big chunks that are stuck in grooves and things, then that might also be removed at this stage. But you can see the variety of the sizes have come through as well. We've got everything here from almost the size of my head to something a bit more turnip-like or maybe even a big parsnip.
And that's very reflective of what a lot of people are seeing in the field, that we're getting a fair mix of sizes. Okay, so nice and clean?
Yeah, so we've got our clean beet sample. So now that's weighed again. So now we have a dirty weight that we started with and a clean weight of the same sample of beet. And what that allows us to calculate is the dirt tare. And then that can be used to back calculate to the lorry to represent how much of the lorry was soil, because of course what we're really looking for is sugar beet, not soil.
So again, it just goes back to how important it is for growers to get the beet out as cleanly as possible, doesn't it?
Exactly, yep. So the next stage here, we've got our clean beet now, is to prepare the actual sample for the laboratory analysis, which is through those doors, and we'll go in there in a second. So this piece of kit in front of us is called the bry saw. So of course the sample will be identified again according to its ID tag that follows it through the whole process, and then it will go into this machine here, which, if you think of it as a drum, which is tumbling the beet inside with a very sharp circular saw protruding into the side of the drum, which means that randomly as the beet comes round, it will get struck by the saw and it will cut into the sugar beet, and it will produce a paste called bry, which is our sample of sugar beet that we will then analyse in the laboratory.
I can see the tin cans there. I take it that's your
so we can
bry
have
samples.
Wander around here, and we'll be able to see a bit easier.
So that's the samples that have now come through.
So essentially, this is an automated laboratory system we're looking at here. So you can see over there some stainless steel buckets. They collect the bry from the bry saw, this sugar beet paste that comes round, and it moves around on a conveyor belt. And then we have, it's more or less a robotic spoon that takes a sample of that bry and puts it into the first stage of our analysis system. So what we have to do is to extract the sugar and the impurities from the bry sample into a solution that we can then analyse the constituent parts of. How we do that is we mix the bry with a lead acetate solution. That extracts the sugar out, but the lead is there to clarify the solution so that the instruments can then read it correctly, because they rely on light passing through the sample, and if it's too murky, the instrument wouldn't be able to function. So we use a clarifying agent to achieve that. And then it will be filtered. So you can see here these big rolls of filter paper, and that's so that the bry sample can be then deposited over here onto the filter paper, and then under vacuum it can be sucked through the filter, so we'll end up with our clarified solution that we will measure the contents.
So from the 50 kilos that collected at the start, it's only 1 tablespoon roughly that you're
so we're talking about 26 grams of bry is what roughly will end up going through this process.
Yep.
Now we've got our solution, it transferred over to our measurement system here. So what we're looking at here, we've already measured our dirt content. That's the first one we measure. We'll now measure 4 other things. We measure our sugar content, sucrose, which is clearly what we're most interested in. And then we measure 3 impurities as well, which are amino nitrogen, sodium and potassium. So the first thing that we measure here is the sugar content. So the clarified sample will get pumped through into this machine here, which is a polarimeter, and this measures the sugar content of the solution that we've just created. And the way that works is sugar as a molecule is able to rotate light as it passes through it, and this instrument is able to detect how much the light has been rotated when it's passed through the solution. So the more sugar you have in the solution, the more rotation of the light you'll get. That will produce a bigger number on the detector, essentially, and we're able, through calibration, to calculate that back to a sugar content.
Okay, and you said you also test for sodium and amino nitrogen.
Yep, and potassium.
Potassium.
So that's what these 2 instruments on the top here do. So this is our impurity measurement station. So the one on the left here is a flame photometer. So what that does is measures the sodium and potassium content of the solution. And you may remember from your GCSE chemistry classes that certain metals, when you hold them in a flame, will actually change colour of the flame. So this instrument here takes advantage of that. So sodium typically gives you an orange colour flame, and potassium will give you a purple colour flame. So that means it's emitting a different wavelength of light. So what this instrument can do is burn the solution by spraying it into a very hot flame, and then it'll actually look at the light that's coming off of the flame, and by how purple it is and how orange it is, it'll be able to calculate back what the sodium and potassium content of the beet is for that.
Okay. And what are you looking for? What would be a good sodium potassium rate?
Oh, so we're into units here, unfortunately. So this instrument is essentially measuring the parts per million, or the concentration of the impurities on the beet. But of course, as a bit sort of topical right now, with a lot of rainfall or not very much rainfall, what you would see is the hydration and the dehydration of the beet, of course, would affect those numbers by how much water there is in the sample. So what we actually do is refer everything back to the sugar content. So it's the impurities, we measure it as a percentage almost of the sugar, and that allows us to keep everything in balance with the water, essentially, so that we don't see the impurities go up every time there's a dry weather spell, or vice versa when we've had lots of rain, because it will always move with the sugar, essentially.
And so do growers actually get a breakdown of those impurities in their report?
Yeah. So they receive their sodium, potassium, and amino nitrogen numbers I think it's on a weekly basis. That's reported to the grower. So it's all associated with their analysis for sugar content, and comes out of I believe it comes out of their My British Sugar portal. Yeah, so you can see some raw results here. So you've got this sample here is a 15.48% sugar, and then we've got 3.68 potassium, 0.86 sodium, and 1.43 amino nitrogen. They probably don't mean much to them on their own, but we'll usually convert those to milligrams on sugar, or millimolar on sugar number, which is the one that we tend to report.
Okay, so show us how to get the sodium, potassium.
Yep.
What about for the amino nitrogen? How do you
The amino nitrogen is this instrument on the right here. So this is called a double beam photometer, and this carries out a small chemical reaction essentially with the solution we've produced. So it uses a copper nitrate solution. Copper will bind with the amino nitrogen content in the solution and produce a blue colour. So what we can do is have two samples, one that gets mixed with copper and the other one that gets mixed with a blank reagent with no copper in it, essentially. One will go blue, the other one will stay as it was, and then by comparing the absorbance between the two samples, you can calculate how much amino nitrogen was present in that sample.
Okay.
Hence the double beam. It needs two beams to measure the reference sample and the actual sample with the copper in it side by side.
And all of this is automated?
It'll just do its thing, and out come the dirt content, the sugar content, sodium, potassium and amino nitrogen for the same sample.
Some of this kit looks fairly new, so is this something new to British Sugar? I know you've always done testing, but
Yep.
Is this sort of system
So these
new?
instruments, you're quite right, they're nice and shiny. I think these have been in for 2 years now. So these were essentially essential replacement for instruments that were old and in need of replacement. So clearly this is a fairly extensive investment, this laboratory.
So I can see from the area in the workspace here that you have a minimum number of staff. I don't suppose many, but I'm assuming that they do a night duty, and I think that I'm right in saying they actually manage all of the samples from all of the sites, don't they?
That's right, yeah. So all of the samples that are taken from the probes on site are transported by lorry to Wissington, and they're all processed through this centralised tear house laboratory. So overnight, that's when all the actual analysis and sample processing is done. You can see a bit of activity going on here, lots of cleaning and maintenance and that, calibrations and things will be done during the day, but yeah, most of the staff are here at night.
Why is it done at night?
So we have the beet samples are all collected through the day. Of course, the weigh bridges are open 5 till 5 or 5 till 6, something like that. So we haven't got a complete set of beet samples from the factory until the end of the day. And then, of course, they have to get to Wissington. So there's a lorry moves them all around, brings them here, and then we would like the data as soon as possible. So we'll have it ready for the morning so we know what's arrived yesterday for use in the factory and accounting and all those purposes.
And any idea on an average day how many samples you'd actually be putting through here?
400, 500, 600 samples will go through overnight and into the morning.
So we've now had a look at the data that's come through, and we can see that all on the screen. What happens next?
So the whole system is computerised, as you can imagine, so it tracks the sample number all the way through this process and is then able to associate the sample and therefore the contract with the analysis that we've produced here. So of course the most important one we'll be thinking about will be the sugar content, and that then can be used to calculate the payment, of course, for the grower once they work back to adjusted tonnes of sugar essentially that's been delivered. So this is all connected to a system called Croplands, which will then take all of this data and move it to where it needs to go.
I mean, we've got a number of samples in front of us here, but you couldn't actually tell whether they are the same contracts, different contracts.
No, that's right. So they've got a unique identifier that's produced when the lorry comes onto site. We can see here which factory these have come from, but that's pretty much it.
And we'll be talking to Simon shortly about the actual sugar impurities and sugar levels for this year, because there's been a little bit drop for the last few years. Have you seen the same this year?
Yes, yeah. So we've seen a general shift in the amount of impurities that are in the beet. Around about five years ago or so, it seemed to take quite a step change for the worse. So more impurities in the beet, and we are trying to understand the reasons behind why that's happened and what we can do about it.
Right. Well, I'm about to speak to Simon, so I shall pick his brains and see if he can add any information for that for us. So thank you ever so much, Perry.
Thank you very much. Cheers.
So it's been great to have a little wander around with Perry and find out how the Tear House is operating and obviously how they're monitoring the sugar levels. But although we can see what's happening here at Tear House level, what's actually happening in field, Simon? How are sugars affected?
Well, it's such a simple question to ask that, isn't it? Of course, you know what my answer's going to be. And it is really incredibly complex. But I wanted to make that point because I think we're often very keen to just find a single factor which is responsible for it. And clearly in 2023, our sugar levels were lower. Typically, they sit between 17 and 17.5. 2023, and I think most growers would have seen this, they're pretty much a whole percentage lower, sitting between 16 and 16.5. So I think there's the question is, why are our sugar levels lower, and particularly the production of sugar in the field? But then we also need to remind ourselves, obviously, when the crops come into the factory and how we extract the sugar from them. And of course, that's what growers are measured on to a degree. Are there factors there which affect that extraction process as well?
And do you find that the sugars fluctuate much across the season? So actually when we're starting to harvest, weather's patterns changing, temperatures changing, is there much difference between what we're seeing in harvesting from, say, end of September to what we potentially will be seeing from the last few crops in February?
I think there's two parts to that question. I think, first of all, we establish a level of sugar production in the field, which I think is the kind of top level. You know, we need good canopies, we need optimum plant densities, and of course, we need good sunshine levels. We shouldn't forget that in July last year, the sunshine levels, which is a key month for the sugar crop, is when we've got our full canopies, and they're very effective, they have very high radiation use efficiency at that time. Actually, our sunshine levels in July 2023 were actually 30% down on where they are on the long-term average. Actually, our sugar level was a little bit lower. You've got to remember, a lot of those crops were late planted as well. So some of them were probably a little bit later to reach full canopy even in July. So we probably didn't have the greatest start. So you get to that point and what a crop can potentially do, but then it can be massively influenced by the weather. And it's probably one of the biggest factors, and it's unfortunate because we can't control it. Can affect it, particularly the two conditions which have been identified over the year. If we have a late summer drought followed by a lot of rain.
When we're looking at the harvesting period, what you're saying really is because there are less sunlight hours, really what you're getting at the end of September, October, there's not going to be a huge amount of change between that and February unless we suddenly have a warm area.
The only other factor which I would introduce in there is obviously if we get a lot of foliar disease. Mm-hmm. And we do know, again, obviously, if we get a lot of disease, and it has to be quite severe infection, and we did see a lot more Cercospora in 2023 than we anticipated, and that's probably a subject of another conversation another day, but we did see it. And of course, what's happening there, you're getting a lot of leaf degradation, leaf senescence. And when that happens within the plant, obviously, you're losing photosynthetic area, so you're you're not going to be able to capture sunlight and convert it into sugar. But also that process of those leaves kind of breaking down mobilises a lot of nitrogen in the plant, which can then be moved down into the root and increase our amino N levels. So again, goes back to my point about you've got what's being produced in the field, but what's happening in this really complex biochemistry in the root. Now, most growers will see their amino Ns because it's when they deliver it, and we know amino N is probably the main impurity. There's lots of impurities, but it's the number one which can result in low sugars. Particularly makes it very difficult to extract sugar efficiently, and means sugar can get carried right through to the later stages of the processes, as we can lose it into molasses as well. So it's a quite an important impurity we need to keep amino N levels low, and I can talk a little bit about the levels we should be targeting in a moment.
I don't suppose many of the growers look that closely at the report back. I mean, it's usually what the sugar levels are, but they can actually see from that what that amino N is. And can you perhaps just tell us a little bit about what affects amino N in the beet itself?
Yeah, so they can see that, and I've had a number of growers last year who were concerned about their sugar levels, and I said, well, let's just grab that data out of your spreadsheet you get back, and let's graph the sugar level and the amino N. And when you did that, you could very quickly see as amino N levels went up, certainly above 100 milligrams per 100 gram of sugar, you could see the sugars come down. So the chemistry is complex. We probably haven't got time to get into that today, but just be assured that when those amino levels go high, you will expect to see your sugar levels go down. So what kind of levels I'm talking about? This is a big generalisation, but I think it's probably a good one. If you are below 100 milligrams of amino N per 100 gram of sugar, you're probably in a safe area. But when they start increasing, certainly up to 150, 200, 300 milligrams of amino N per 100 gram, you're going to see effects on your sugar level.
And 300 grams, I mean, that's a massive increase, isn't it?
It is, but what is quite characteristic of last year, and a lot of growers have said to me, they've seen some very variable amino Ns, even within the same field where they've been able to track fields, and some have, and I've seen some values as high as that. It's not unusual, we do see it, and in the days when we were pouring on very large amount of nitrogen and manures as well, we sometimes saw that.
So just tell me a little bit about what is causing a high level of amino acids. What's actually happening throughout the season that's making those changes?
It is effectively having too much nitrogen in the plant or having it remobilised. So there's a number of things going on. Clearly, if we put lots of nitrogen on, certainly more than the crop needs, particularly on fertile soils, so silts, clay loams and organic and peaty soils, where there's a lot of residual nitrogen, there is a risk there we will encourage a nitrogen uptake and we'll have a lot more nitrogen. I already talked about the fact where we have diseases and often that when we get that leaf degradation, and also following drought, of course, so that there's a lot of remobilisation of nitrogen from the leaves down into the roots, of course. So they're some of the key factors that can influence that.
But surely in this last sort of year, 18 months, we've been reducing the use of nitrogen in the field. Wouldn't we have expected to see an increase then in sugars?
I think probably putting the right amount on is fine. I think it's in those situations where we get too high, and I think particularly situations where we've used manures and probably even cover crops, particularly if we've got legumes in it. But also I think then this indicates the weather patterns, because obviously we can sometimes start picking up nitrogen from the soil late in the season, particularly if we have a year like we had last year. We might have lost a little bit of nitrogen early on in the season, but as the roots kind of got deeper and deeper, they started picking up a lot more of that nitrogen. So I think one of the key messages is we have to really manage our nitrogen applications really carefully to make sure we're not putting too much on and getting ourselves into situations where the weather patterns go against us. They may get a flush of nitrogen, particularly late in the season, which will drive our amino Ns. But it's not the only factor. I mean, we do tend to point the finger at nitrogen fertilisers, but there are many other factors. And I say the factors such as drought and things and disease as well probably work separately from nitrogen, but they are factors we can manage.
So let's look a little bit about drought, because obviously that's been something that's more impacted over the last sort of 3-4 years than we've seen in many years before. Is there anything that we could actually be doing to try and mitigate the drought impact and obviously the increase of the amino nitrogen?
I think there absolutely are, but just remember the drought effects, they have twofold in a way. First of all, there's the effect of remobilising nitrogen in the plant, but also, obviously, following drought and rain, the plant, sugar beet being biennial, will try and grow again, and obviously to do that, it will rob sugar from the root. So there's almost a double whammy effect. I think one of the areas I would like to remind ourselves of, the more we can do to improve our resilience of our soils to drought, the less likely we are to see this such amount of leaf senescence, degradation after drought events. So back to things like improving soil health, in trying to improve organic matter, improving soil structure, putting manures on, improving the fertility of it. We have to do it in a managed way, because if you remember, I've already said if we go too far, it can actually make the problem work. But actually trying to improve the drought resilience of our crops actually will quite have an effect.
That's one thing we can do. Obviously, we can do very little when it comes to sunlight hours.
Yep.
But is it again something we need to be looking at? Is there a difference in varieties for the sugar impurity levels?
Good question. If you look at impurities or even like sugar content, so if you cast your eye over the 2024 RL list, you'll see there probably is a difference of around 1%. So there's an intrinsic genetic difference. But what I would now say is actually other effects are much more important, and I think it's probably 3 times more important, the site effects rather than the variety effects. Mm-hmm. But clearly, if you do have a persistent problem with sugars, or you're looking maybe to early lifting, try and go with a variety which we know genetically tends to produce a higher sugar, will probably put you in a better position, won't it? But I think actually, yes, genetics, there is a small effect, but by the most significant effects are site effects. I think we talked about nitrogen, and again, I think I would reiterate, making sure we assess our nitrogen status of the soil and only apply a nitrogen to what the crop needs is really important. Talked about building soil resilience. I'd also just remind people, for anybody who have low potash soils, and I'm talking index of 0, 1 and below, potash is quite important, particularly for canopy growth and persistence in drought. So we do know, and there's been work which showed that if you get very low soil potash, you can see increased amino ends and low sugars as well. So making sure, I think majority of growers' crops are probably on higher indices, but if you are in that situation, and many growers may not have been applying potash over the last few years because of the cost of fertilisers, if you are particularly indexes 1 and 0, make sure we're putting some potash on.
Any idea how that works?
Principally through affecting the soil, the moisture status of the plant. Potash is a really important osmoregulator, so it's actually allowing those plants to remain turgid and keep going stronger. You tend not to get the resulting leaf death. Mm-hmm. You know, many growers have seen it after a drought. You see the whole of the bottom 50% of the leaves just die off. You'll prevent that and prevent that process of then remobilising nitrogen. The other areas, I think 2 other areas I'd cover off is obviously making sure we keep our crops protected, particularly against disease, and that was challenging in 2023. We did see a bit of Sarcospora come in, but making sure we're really attending to the detail to keep those crops so we're not getting this senescence of the leaves. And the other one is just worth reflecting on, and probably lose sight of it, and it's been very challenging this year because of harvesting conditions, is root damage. We know if we cause a lot of root damage, root tip breakage and root damage, we will then accelerate sugar loss quite considerably. I think the work has shown it's probably respiration, which is our main cause of sugar loss, is 3 times higher in badly damaged roots as opposed to undamaged ones, and particularly if temperatures are still warm. So obviously early campaign where temperatures are probably still above 10 degrees and lots of root damage, we'll lose sugar there as well. So again, it just reinforces like it's never going to be one thing. It's going to be a combination of factors which we really need to attend to the detail of.
And it goes to show that even if you've got reasonable sugars, if you get sugars at 17, but you know full well you've had some instance of drought or you've got disease, there is more to be had, isn't there? If people just pay that little bit more attention.
One more relationship is probably just worth drawing attention to people is obviously, and it's a bit of a general one, obviously in years of high yields, particularly large roots, and we got some very large roots from last year, you tend to see a decline of sugar. If you just think about the complex biochemistry of obviously getting sugar produced and moved in, if you've got very large roots with probably very large cells in the roots, you've got a lot more challenge with regards getting sugar moved into those cells. So we do tend to see as yields go up, sugars do tend to decline. Now intuitively that feels wrong, doesn't it? But I think what I'm trying to say, there's a bit of a sweet spot, sorry about that, but quite sweet spot between root size and sugar. And obviously that's what you see when returns come back. But obviously I think in years where we have got some very large roots, we would probably generally expect to see some lower sugars. It's purely a dilution effect really, isn't it? You've got some very large roots, But it reinforces the point of obviously in those situations we need to keep those canopies as productive and producing sugar as long as possible to make sure we can fill those cells up with sugar.
And certainly for the 2023 year, I mean, we've got good-sized roots, but actually when you think that most of it was drilled in, late April, May time,
yeah.
I mean, the growth there has been huge, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's getting that combination of root growth and sugar production, isn't it?
Yeah.
So we've seen some fantastic growth, but actually, again, bear in mind my comments about sunshine levels in July, we've probably not been able to keep track with sugar production, and the fact we've got those big cells in those roots makes it challenging to get the sugar moved in. I'm not going to go into all the kind of complexities of the sucrose gradient hypothesis, but it's quite important.
Well, that's great. So thanks so much for that, Simon. That's given us a real good insight into not only what's happening, but some of the small tweaks that we can make to hopefully bring the sugars up for future years. So thank you for your time.
No problem.
Hopefully that's provided you some food for thought for managing your crop going forward in 2024. And just a quick reminder that we have our BeetTech 24, and that's the 6th of February at Newmarket, 8th of February at Belton Woods, and drill training is the 20th of February at Morley Farms, 21st of February at Risehome Campus. To book for any of these events, please go to our website www.bbro.co.uk/events. Thank you for listening.